Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we give our thoughts on the Mets moving on from Buck Showalter, then break down the introduction of David Stearns as the leader of the organization. We also announce the winner of our scoreboard predictions and close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your shows. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And here's your reminder to subscribe to our show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel if you want to watch it there, or wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And it is a new era for our New York Mets, as it's a massive week. They introduced David Stearns to lead this organization for what we expect to be a long time. But Joe, before we get into that introduction and what lies ahead, we do have to look behind, as the Mets have decided to move on from Buck Showalter as their manager of this organization. Buck was here for 2 years, one phenomenal year where the Mets had, it felt like an incredible regular season that ended in disappointment. And unfortunately, that disappointment carried over to 2023, where they did not meet expectations. So the Buck era ends. What are your thoughts on how all of this went down, Joe?
I mean, I think it went as normal as you possibly could. I know there was a lot of noise about how the Mets handled it. David Stearns could not be a Mets employee until Monday. He was under contract with the Milwaukee Brewers. He could not, legally within the rules of Major League Baseball, call Buck Showalter on Saturday and say, "Hey, Buck, I'm taking over on Monday, but you're not going to be the manager any longer." So he put that, and Billy Eppler made the call. They told Buck on Saturday, and he got Sunday to get the "thank you, Buck" on the scoreboard. The players were able to, give him the round of applause as he did the lineup card. So, is it awkward? Sure. But I think that just comes with the territory of firing anybody. Firing any manager is kind of awkward. So David Stearns had the right, as someone who came in as president of baseball operations, to pick who his manager is going to be. And I think Buck's status of being on a one-year deal, you don't want to have a lame duck manager when you're coming in. David Stearns is building something new here with the Mets. And the idea is that he wants a manager that he can grow with over, hopefully, the many, many years that he is in charge here. So obviously great memories with Buck. The Mets had one of the best seasons of our entire life in 2022 as fans, and he's a big reason for that. And I think the Mets will have a lot of positive things to take from Buck's couple years here that they're going to be able to take forward as an organization, with attention to detail and things like that. I think he'll leave a bit of a lasting effect, but this was just, unfortunately, I think the right time and right place for things to happen.
I'm with you. For me, there's a lot to unpack here, right? Number one being that, because I've seen the conversation like at its surface level be like, well, this wasn't Buck's fault, or wasn't all Buck's fault. And yeah, I don't think that's wrong, but you can look at things in a vacuum and say the Mets underachieved in 2023 greatly. And I don't think Buck Showalter was the reason for that. I also don't think he was the solution for a lot of things. I also think timelines comes into my mind here, Joe. And this is the number one thing the Mets are, obviously being very honest about, is that this timeline now is totally different with David Stearns here. This is his organization. Everything that the Mets do going forward is going to be molded by the hands of David Stearns and who he chooses to delegate very important tasks to beneath him, right? And that will continue with Billy Eppler being a part of that. But still, if David Stearns feels like it's not time, anymore for Buck Showalter to be the manager of this team, then the time is to move on now, rather than having lingering things carrying over from a different era where everybody's on a different timeline. And the third thing is, which kind of piggybacks off of timelines, but is different, Buck was brought here for a very different purpose than where the Mets stand now, right? When Steve Cohen bought this team, Steve Cohen could not just buy everything that comes with building a successful sports organization. he was able to do it in free agency that gave the Mets a shot in the arm, right? He was able to get veteran players, and he was able to make some moves like the pitching lab they've been working on. But sports organizations are also run behind the scenes by top-level executives, and that was something Steve Cohen had to wait for. So what the Mets did was they signed a lot of high-priced veterans, and they went for things in a very tight window with older players that you knew in 3 or 4 years are not going to be part of this organization. And Buck followed that mold. The hiring of Buck was to get someone with experience that can help you win now. It was all about the now. It was all about veteran players. None of Buck's hire was about the guys that were in A-ball or AA or AAA at the time being developed by him, or for the better good of the organization when Buck is gone. It was all about winning as many games as you could, really in a 2 to 3 year window. It worked in year 1. It didn't work in year 2. Now the Mets are on to something else. And you and I firmly believe that the Mets aren't in this blow it up rebuild year. We think it's a bridge year, retooling year. The Mets will be highly competitive next year, but the Mets might not put their foot on the gas pedal where they're going 120 miles an hour, doing every last thing they can to win a World Series. They might just be going 60 on cruise control for once, make a big move here and then kind of see where it goes while you learn a lot about young guys in your organization. I think, quite frankly, Joe, you can say Buck Showalter is a good baseball man that has done a lot of great things in this league. And on the other hand, you can say the Mets are going in a direction right now that Buck does not fit. And I think ultimately David Stearns making this call along with Steve Cohen and the Mets organization gives me confidence that it was the right one, as much as it's a tough emotional one.
I think it's very fair, everything you just said. And it was a bridge, right? That was the whole objective here, was Buck Showalter, the Max Scherzers, the Justin Verlanders, all these high-priced older players that they were signing were signed to be bridge players to get to the next layer of where Steve Cohen wanted to be. Because Steve Cohen said back when he bought the team, and he said basically every step along the way, one of his priorities was to have a top-level farm system, to have a top-level player development system. He didn't, and he said as recently as last year, he's like, I don't want to spend this kind of money. I mean, look, it's fun, and we could talk about the payroll, and he spent 300 and whatever million, and then you take the luxury tax on top of it. That's another like he spent nearly $500 million on a roster that fell apart. And the reality is, if that's the case, Steve Cohen wants to learn a lesson from that. I mean, you don't want to just keep throwing money at this thing. And that doesn't mean, like you said, Connor, I'm sure there's going to be a big move or two this offseason. I'm sure David Stearns will want to make an impression as far as what he's capable of in his first offseason. But look, that they're heading in a different direction where next year is going to be, whatever it's going to be. We're going to talk about that a little more in a little bit, and obviously over the coming months. But yeah, Buck Showalter's status, I think, was something that they had to address now, so that way David Stearns can move in the direction where he wants to be managerially. And if you are Steve Cohen and you're hiring David Stearns and paying him what he's reportedly being paid, which is the highest or near the highest paid executive in the sport, the last thing you want to do is be telling him, well, welcome to New York. Buck Showalter's your manager because he has a year left on his contract. You say, do you want Buck or do you not? And if he says no, then you make the tough decision, and it's just, bad PR or emotional for a couple days, and then people move on, and it's time to find the next one.
That's how it goes in the game. So a thank you to Buck Showalter for the good times, and we look ahead towards more happy times in Mets land, without him right now. It's just the nature of the sport, and we are obviously excited to see what David Stearns can do for this organization. And let's dive into his introduction or reintroduction to the team. This is somebody that grew up a Mets fan. I think that was one of the cooler parts of the entire presser, is just saying, now we're happy our kids can grow up Mets fans. I think it does mean something a little different to him to come back here, now under different ownership since he was last here, where he can mold his childhood team into a sustainable winner. And I think what everybody's wondering, Joe, is how long do these things take, right? I think if you're David Stearns, we do this exercise a lot. A lot of people listening know this. I cover the NFL draft year round. It's one of my full-time jobs. And a lot of times we have conversations of, if you were looking for a place to go that's open, what organization would you look to go? And when you take it over to baseball and look at the Mets right now, there's a lot of big positives about coming over and taking the Mets. And it's not just your paycheck, which is a nice one for David Stearns, and good for him. He was able to earn that. But it's the fact that the farm system looks a lot different after the trade deadline. Something he directly mentioned is the resources that come with working for Steve Cohen are a little different in terms of what you could spend on. Joe, I think that Stearns is here knowing that there are no limitations and that the Mets can always be contending. But what does the timeline look right now for the Mets now that he's in the building?
I think everyone has this perception of 2024. We even have talked about it on this show, a bridge year. But what does a bridge year exactly mean? Because Steve Cohen has said it, Billy Eppler has said it, now David Stearns has said it. The expectation is for them to contend in 2024. Contending, it's a bit of a loose term. I mean, look at the wild card playoffs that are starting here on Tuesday. It is not hard to contend for a wild card spot.
Yeah, the Marlins are in it. So
is that their baseline, is contending for a wild card spot, or is it upper 80s wins instead of upper 90s wins when you talk about just preseason projections? And the big thing is going to be too that they're going to have the flexibility where they could go in with whatever the preseason expectations are, and if they exceed those expectations, then Steve Cohen has the resources to say, I'll approve whatever financial resource it is to help us at the trade deadline. The farm system, like you said, Connor, is at a position where the Mets, it's a bit deeper now, and it's going to get deeper with the upcoming draft class and international signing class, and it's just going to continue to grow on top of itself. Now you're going to have the ability to use prospects for trades. When you get deeper, you have the ability to trade from maybe lower on your list, whereas when the Mets had a bit of a top-heavy, shallow system before, you wanted to call and make a trade, teams were like, well, the only guys I actually like are Alvarez, Beatty, Pete Crow Armstrong, and like Mauricio. And that was just it. So there wasn't anything you could do on a significant level without trading from your very select few of prospects you're very high on. So I do think 2024 is going to be a year they look to contend. I don't think David Stearns took this job with the idea of, I'm not going to try to win year one. And I got no indications from anything he said yesterday to think otherwise. But I like that he has that long-term vision. And it's something that's been echoed by Steve Cohen and Billy Eppler prior. So you could tell that there's some synergy here in thought process, that they want to win in 2024, but they're not going to completely borrow from 2025 and 2026 in order to do that. And that's, instead of being very short-sighted, they're being big picture thinking, which is where ultimately you want the organization to be.
Yeah, I think they're going to be delicate with some of the resources that they have right now, rather than always kind of, this is a really low-hanging fruit example, but it's the easiest one, I think, to use. The Javi Baez trade, where you trade Pete Crow Armstrong, a former first-rounder that's now a big-time prospect with the Cubs. The Mets were trying to get a jolt at the deadline that year, and that's just not a move that I think you're going to see under David Stearns in year one. I think that, they're going to have to be pretty far along, not just hanging around, to make those kinds of moves. So
that was an emotional move. That's what it was at the time. An emotional move instead of a rational move. So I think David Stearns will be, and yes, he is analytical, and we'll talk obviously more about him here, but he's an analytical-based guy. But the vibes I got yesterday was someone that understands people, someone that knows that there's not a secret sauce. And that's something that I think a lot of people in the analytics side of the game think it's all numbers, and I can use my computer to tell you that this team is going to work and going to do this. Human element. I think David Stearns is a good blend of understanding the human element exists. And part of that is probably his upbringing as a huge baseball fan, but he's also going to be the smartest person in the room basically almost any time he walks into one, and he can use those numbers to his advantage.
All right, so the next topic in order with Stearns is obviously Pete Alonso. This is a conversation that is not going anywhere until a decision is made, whether it's Pete and the Mets come to an extension, the Mets come to a trade agreement with someone else, or quite simply, option number 3, which I think, Joe, is where we're headed in this entire thing. The Mets, and David Stearns said he expects Pete Alonso to be the opening day first baseman in 2024. the Mets might just play out 2024, let Pete go to free agency like the Yankees did with Aaron Judge and the Mets did with Brandon Nimmo, as we said, figure it out from there. This is going to be a big one for Stearns, right, Joe? Because you brought up emotion and how it can be a negative in the sporting world, especially when you're an executive. And I think that there are times where you do have to realize, yes, there are hard decisions to be made, but emotions do matter. I think the emotions of Mets fans coincide with Pete Alonso's tenure as a Met. And I think that is something that, like, if David Stearns' first move is he trades Pete Alonso, whether we're a little different, right? Because we love Pete on the show, but we also look at things as, we look at prospects and team building, a lot of things. But I don't consider us the majority Met fan. And the majority Met fan is super important when having this conversation right now. The majority Met fan is going to look at David Stearns and say that you came here and the first thing you did was trade Pete Alonso. Every move he makes after that will be judged in a negative light until it shows to be a positive move. So this is a tough one for David Stearns, right? Because I want to be fair to the Mets. We don't know what Pete Alonso is asking for. And we know the Mets in this regime are not cheap. Like, I don't think the Mets are looking at one of their franchise players and saying, let's ask him for a hometown discount because we really need to pinch the pennies here. I personally don't believe that. And for Pete and his agent, they're probably doing everything they can for their own good because that's a right you earn when you get closer to free agency. And they haven't found middle ground on an extension yet. And now, Joe, that massive, massive task is on the platter of David Stearns right away.
It's a huge task for him. I think he has a lot that he has to do here over the next couple months. So I lean kind of where you were, Connor, option 3, that the most likely scenario is that they play this out and they see how 2024 goes. I'm sure they'll talk to Pete's agent this offseason. You give it another shot in the springtime because you often see a lot of extensions signed kind of in spring training before opening day. But we don't know what either side is looking for contractually. I don't think Pete's going to be traded. I think David Stearns saying he expects Pete to be the first baseman on opening day is a genuine statement, not just GM speak or executive speak. I think he knows that Pete Alonso matters. And he even had mentioned, we were talking about the emotion and everything with that. He's like, yeah, I recognize that being homegrown, proving you could do it in New York, that's part of what we're putting together in the package of a player. You have to know that he could do it, and Pete can handle New York. So I don't think he's going to be traded. I honestly don't think he's going to get extended this offseason either. I think David Stearns is going to focus on building up his infrastructure. They need a head of player development, and they've cycled through heads of player development more than they've cycled through general managers and managers. So that needs to stop. Like, one of the big things that David Stearns needs to do is put people in place, and they need to have a leash. They need to have a window. This can't be every single year, every other year. If something doesn't go right, you just fire someone and bring someone new in. There needs to be continuity. Those are how the best organizations operate. So this is the first time that I think the Mets brought in an executive where I feel that is a legitimate possibility. And Pete Alonso is obviously going to be a big part of this team in 2024. And I think ultimately he's going to be a Met long-term. It's just might be a painful process that plays out over the next 12 to 14 months where Mets fans are going to see rumors of Pete visiting with the Padres or the Giants or whoever has money that given offseason and worry that Pete's leaving. The one thing I'll always say, Steve Cohen can beat any offer his heart desires. So if he wants to, he could do it. So I suspect Pete's going to be here long-term. I just think fans are going to have to deal with just a lot of articles and a lot of noise and a lot of Joe and Connor talking about what the future for Pete Alonso holds over the next year plus. So at least you have us to talk about it.
All right. And our lovely commercials, by the way, that you can see on SNY,
yes.
Which hopefully, I love when people bring those up to me. They're like, man, I've seen a lot of you and Joe, not just on the podcast. We had a lot of fun with those. Listen, I think it's like this for Pete, to be fair. Pete should be a lifelong Met. If he is going to break a lot of records here. He is one of the heart and soul players of this team. He's a middle order bat that can turn a game at any point. Like, all of those things are true. And Pete Alonso we think he'll be here and should be here. David Stearns is also paid a lot of money to handle negotiations in a professional manner. Anybody, Joe, could sit in that chair and be like, well, I don't want to lose Pete Alonso, so here's 10 years, $400 million. Anyone could do that. Literally, anyone could do that. David Stearns has paid a lot of money to build this team in a precise manner. And I'm not saying the Mets are penny pinching. I'm just saying there's strategy to this where hypothetically, and we don't know. We don't know. But the fact that it's gotten this far, there are things that at least you can use logic to kind of determine. Say Pete's camp goes, listen, he's the heart and soul of the Mets. He's going to be a franchise player. Other franchise players get 8 to 10 years. We want 8 to 10 years. And maybe the Mets are looking at it and saying, you know what? We love Pete, but we're not really in the business right now of just handing out all these 10-year deals. It's something that we're not looking to make a habit of.
Look at where the Padres are heading. The Padres have almost $100 million committed to 2029 because of all the crazy long-term deals.
For the people listening to this going, who cares? It's not my money. Well, look at how it does impact organizations long-term. There is eventually an end, even for the richest people in the world. Yeah. The richest people in the world are the wealthiest people in the world for a reason. So maybe the Mets are sitting here and going, well, we're comfortable paying Pete as the highest paid first baseman. I'm confident the Mets have no problem doing that. But we like 6 years. And if they aren't finding common ground, you say, okay, you think you can get 9, go find out. And if you get 9, maybe we'll do 9. But if you can only get 6 on the open market, you should take our 6 or 7. This is all hypotheticals, and this is just a scenario. Right. But this is how contracts work out, where it's not. I get the fan outrage. I feel you. Like, I see it on the Instagram comments of the Mets. I see it on Twitter. I totally understand. But there are, going all the way back to the beginning of the pod, Joe, emotional decisions and rational decisions. There's a reason sometimes these things take a little longer to play out. And now they have an adult in the room that I'm confident will take the most wise route to finding the solution here.
Yeah, I couldn't be more confident in what David Stearns is going to bring to this team. And, we've talked about him for years. I mean, think about it. Before we were even doing the Mets pod, when we were doing our own pod. So if you listen to that and you followed us over here, thank you for still hanging on. But we've been talking about David Stearns this long. And Steve Cohen even said in the press conference that he's been waiting for the right guy. And they asked, did you talk to anyone else? He said, no. So he's been waiting for this specific person for years. They could say whatever. David Stearns has been the guy since almost day one that he's been waiting for. He's asked for permission year in and year out, been told no. He got free, and Steve Cohen wasn't going to let him out of his grasp. So they got, I think, the right guy to make this decision. And the whole contractual thing is just going to be very obnoxious for the next year plus, unless somebody gives on either end this offseason or this spring.
So the next order of business is Billy Eppler. And there's not really an order of business here, Joe, because here's a couple of quotes from Stearns in the presser. He said, Billy and I have had a really nice relationship going back years as competitors, talking to each other, whether it's about transactions or about industry events. I have a lot of respect for the experience he has in this game, the experience he has in New York, and I am looking forward to working with him. Stearns said it will take weeks and months working with the entire front office before he can delegate individual responsibilities. So that quote from Stearns on Eppler, it's obviously Eppler is going to be here. We've been kind of sure of this for quite some time, and we think Eppler has a lot of value, specifically in the region of Japanese baseball, which he, by the way, folks, is a massive 1-for-1 right now with the Mets, with your guy in Kodai Senga that will be getting Cy Young votes this year. So I think that's a big part of it. But also, Joe, I think Stearns is someone who, it's another thing he discussed, wants to accumulate talent in the front office. And if he sees things that Billy Eppler is very good at, they're not just going to have Billy Eppler walk and fire him and pay him out his contract or anything like that. Eppler, to me, is a good example of how Stearns wants, he's the guy, but he's also going to have quantity and quality in this front office to cover as much ground as they can as an organization.
And he made it clear, and Will Salmon told us about this when we had him on to talk about David Stearns, that he's good at being a delegator, which is very important to be a leader at that level. Is you have to hire the best people that you can, and they're going to use the term best in class until they're blue in the face. That's I guess the term that they want to go with, but they want best in class in everything. And that means when you hire those people and you pay them whatever it takes to get the best in class, you have to empower them. And sure, David Stearns is going to be the guy that makes the ultimate decision. Any move that the Mets make in baseball operations from here on out get cleared by David Stearns. But Billy Eppler can provide value, not just in Japan, that, we've talked about that, and we'll talk about Yoshinobu Yamamoto for the next couple months until whatever transpires there. But I think he's going to provide value in the day-to-day stuff, because I don't think David Stearns is going to get too caught up in the minutia of all the every waiver claim, every optioning of a player and recalling of a player. Anything big and important, he's going to be very hands-on with. But I think Billy Eppler is going to provide value on that day-to-day basis. And I mean, all you have to do is read articles about how they approach Kodai Senga, how they approach different free agents. There's a lot of background stories, a lot by Will Salmon, who I just mentioned, and Tim Britton over The Athletic, that get very unique stories of the background of the kind of work that Billy Eppler puts in. And that sounds like a guy that's a valuable asset to an organization. So I'm not surprised that they want to keep him around. And, we'll see how it transpires, because a lot of what's here is going to stay. Executives don't come in and clean house. That's just not like a normal way to do things. He'll bring in some of his guys. Maybe he'll replace a couple guys that are here or girls. But David Stearns is someone I think that's going to come in and evaluate what the Mets have in-house. And Billy Eppler is going to be a valuable, right-hand man for David Stearns. I have no doubt about that.
So the last thing here, I think, is we opened with Buck Showalter no longer being the manager of this team. And now it's who will be the manager of this team. And Joe, it's not our first rodeo, right? It really isn't. We've done this before. But I think we're going to have, and appreciate all the mailbag questions we got in Joe's mentions, we're going to have a deeper conversation on the pool of candidates as we get interview lists and rumors and names like that. But Joe, I think the one name right now that we can definitively discuss being linked to the Mets is Craig Counsell, because Craig Counsell has worked with David Stearns in Milwaukee, and Craig Counsell has an expiring contract, and I think this one is not going away until the Mets opt to hire someone else, if they do.
I think Craig Counsell, and I don't have sources like SNY's Andy Martino does. This is just me trying to use logic in my brain. Craig Counsell has to be the leader in the clubhouse. He has a prior relationship with David Stearns. Yes, he inherited him, but he inherited him, and they've had a copious amount of success together, as the Milwaukee Brewers have been in the playoffs basically every single year that David Stearns was in charge there, or at least above 500. And Craig Counsell managed for most of those years. And I find it peculiar that he has not signed an extension with the Brewers yet. Not only has he not signed an extension,
right,
he's turned down an extension. And I'm not going to say that I'm an expert on the history of managers going into free agency, etc., but I don't feel like managers go into free agency all that often. I feel like you're either fired or extended,
very rare,
and that's it. So maybe Counsell is unique, because you all know the story if you're listening to this. He's from Wisconsin. He has, a couple of daughters in high school. He has a couple sons playing Division I sports in kind of the Midwest area. He's a Midwest guy. Like, that's what Craig Counsell is. Then why wouldn't you just sign an extension? Like, why do you want to go to free agency? So to me, I think we're going to hear about other candidates, and, we'll see everything that happens with Craig Counsell. But right now, I think Craig Counsell is going to be the next manager of the Mets, because there's no reason why he hasn't signed yet. So I think he wants to see what's out there, and maybe he takes a Mets offer back to Milwaukee and gets Milwaukee to give some more money, and he stays. That's a distinct possibility. But this just feels like peculiar to me, which makes me think Craig Counsell will probably be the next manager of the Mets.
It does feel like he's obviously the leader in the clubhouse right now because he's the one name we can definitively connect to this team.
Yeah.
And Joe, your point about him turning down an extension is the most interesting to me because it's just pretty unique territory in that field. Guys that manage baseball teams don't treat it like they're a superstar free agent where they're like, you know what, I'll just go field the highest offer externally and go to the place that has the best chance to win and all of these great things. They don't treat it like that. So often they just sign the extension and stay until, unfortunately, they're fired and the deal is paid out. So that is definitely the one to watch and something we will cover very closely here on the Mets Pod. A reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to our podcast at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Now, sadly, I have to recap the scoreboard because a champion, you see him smiling, a champion must be crowned now that the season is over. One last time for the 2023 season. The over-under push was set at 2 for Pete Alonso home runs in the last 6 games. He only hit 1, so Joe got it. No, he only hit 1, so Joe didn't get it. You pushed. I went over. Pete went under. No points awarded. Jeff McNeil hits in the last 6 games. Joe, you pushed. I went under. Jeff only had 1 hit. Obviously,
he got hurt.
He got hurt. So, but hey, so listen to this, people. By the way, Joe is the champion, if you can't tell yet. Joe texted the group complaining about the injury. Like, injuries aren't baked into betting. That's one of the biggest things when you bet when you bet futures is the injuries. So I get a point, finally. It's been a long time. Kodai Senga's strikeouts in his last start was set at 7. Joe, you pushed. I went over. He had 8. I got another point. Mark Vientos' home runs in the last 6 games was set at 1. We both pushed. He hit 1. We both got a point. We actually did pretty good this week, Joe. Finally. Ronnie Mauricio home runs in the last 6 games was set at 1. Joe, you went under. I pushed. Nothing from Mauricio. Joe gets the point. Over-under push was set at 3 for Brett Beatty hits in the last 6 games. Joe, you went over. I went under. Beatty had 4. Joe gets another point. Over-under push was set at 1 for Brandon Nimmo home runs in the last 6 games. Joe, you went under. I went with a push. No home runs for Nimmo. Another point to Joe. Jeez. Over-under push was set at 1 for Alvarez home runs in the next 6 games. Francisco hit 2. And Joe, you went under. I pushed. So he went over. No points awarded. Over-under push was set at 1 for Francisco Lindor. Stolen bases in the next 6 games. Joe, you pushed. I went under. He had 1. Joe gets the point. Will Starling Marte play one of the last 6 games? We both went with no. We both got a point. This was actually our best week, I think, ever, Joe. You won 6-4. I think almost every week it was 1-0, 2-1, or maybe 2-0 at some of the best. So, Joe, you win the season 33-24, a mammoth final week. You really had a mammoth stretch run. I feel like you dominated the last month of this award after kind of sleepwalking through it for the first 3 months of the season. So, a shout out to you. You are the champion. We'll figure out some kind of prize for Joe.
Yeah, I'll be getting something. I was the Yoenis Cespedes. I came in
maybe a Mets Pod T-shirt.
I picked it up then. Maybe. We're
don't get your hopes up for that. Yeah. So
we will be getting them eventually. We are told.
Give us a shout if you've won a Mets Pod T-shirt. We'd love to see them. We'd love to know who already got their stuff. So let's jump into the mailbag here because we got a lot of good questions this week. A lot of responses to Joe's tweet that he sends out every week for our mailbag, which he's at PSL to Flushing. I am at Connor J. Rogers. And the first one here is from Mickey Taywill, who asked, at what point will we see the Mets trade from their upper level minor league guys? They currently have 5 players that can be playing in 2024 with Jet, Acuna, Mauricio, Beatty, Vientos. Why do you think they will target, who do you think they will target, an established big leaguer or a prospect swap? So, Joe, I think that basically the crux of this, right, is I would also include Drew Gilbert in that conversation as well to add to Mickey's group. I think the crux of this is the offseason that you move some of your upper level farm system talent for a pro ready player, or does so much of that just depend on who's available and what the cost is? Because I think we're not prospect hugging, but it's nice to have depth of the organization where you don't want to just give it all away and find yourself right back to where you were.
I am largely prospect hugging. That's what I do. But I think it does ultimately depend on who is available. Are we talking about Corbin Burns? Are we talking about Brandon Woodruff? Are we talking about a frontline guy? Or are we talking about trading for a mid-level starter that has a couple of years of control on them? So it depends what we're looking at here. But ultimately, I don't think the Mets are going to be in any rush to trade from the top end of their system or top end of their talent, because we've said this a million times over. Anytime you think you have too much of something, you probably have the right amount, because
we've lived it.
Yeah, Brett Baty hasn't shown much. So I certainly think there's still a future for Brett Baty, but it's clouded right now. Ronnie Mauricio got just such a small sample size here, and he flashed, but it's such a small sample size. Can you count on it? Mark Vientos is a man largely without a position, so he's kind of a DH. What does that do for trade value? How many people are trading for like a right-handed DH / sometimes first baseman and giving up something of note for him? And you just traded for Luis Angel Acuna, Drew Gilbert, like you mentioned. You have Jet Williams. These guys at the top of the system, you want to keep those guys around. If you want to pay Pete Alonso $200 and something million, if you want to talk about Yoshinobu Yamamoto at $200 million, you want to consider Juan Soto next offseason. You want to consider Shohei Ohtani this offseason. Like all these big names that are going to be free this year or next. If you want to sign those guys, you need some of these young players in place, taking up everyday roles. It's just a balance of balancing the checkbook, essentially. Not penny pinching, but you're not going to pay all 9 offensive players, all 5 starting pitchers, and then pay your bullpen too. So I don't think they should be in a rush, but David Stearns gets to come into this organization with a fresh set of eyes. He has no attachment to any prospect player, anything in the organization. He can just look at it and say, this is the right move for the Mets to win. So a long way of saying be open-minded, but I wouldn't be in a rush to move anybody.
No, I don't think they'll operate that way. You know, I think if anything, they would do it for pitching that they can control, whether that's an extension they already know they can, apply or whatever it may be, and not young controlled pitching. And honestly, a lot of teams aren't in a position to often move that. So we'll see where it goes. I think the prospects will come into play maybe at the deadline at the earliest, I would say, but I would probably be thinking the offseason in 2020, obviously for the 2025 season. And I also think that, Joe, there's all these conversations, right? And you look at it, like everybody's excited about the idea of the Padres might have to trade Juan Soto before they just lose him to free agency for essentially nothing. If you're the Mets and Juan Soto is not signing an extension anywhere before he makes it to free agency, why would you trade for Juan Soto? You need the one more year? I mean, I don't.
It's definitely a good question. You have to hope it's not a Mookie Betts situation or a Paul Goldschmidt situation.
That's fair.
Where
That's fair.
They were traded and then did sign an extension. So you definitely have to monitor it. I think Juan Soto is someone that fits ideally what the Mets want: power, on base, and young. Like he's exactly what the Mets are looking for. I can wait a year on him, but if it's an indication from his camp or whatever that Juan Soto's willing to sign an extension with certain teams if they trade for him, then that has to be accounted for in the value of a trade where, all right, I'm maybe a little more willing to part with something if it means I'm locking up Juan Soto for the next decade.
All right, our next question here it's a really interesting one from Jason Martin, and we're going to have a lot of combos like this in the long winter ahead, but we'll do a little teaser here. Jason asked, how is the lineup different next year versus how they ended this current year? Just crossing fingers some of the vets who were down come back to form. He goes, see below other than LeCastro. And he sent us the lineup from September 27th, against the Marlins. And so I'll just read it because obviously a lot of people are probably listening to this and not looking up at the tweet. Brandon Nimmo leading off, staple. He's here for a very long time. Ronnie Mauricio batting second, Pete Alonso batting third, Francisco Lindor batting cleanup, Mark Vientos DHing in the 5-hole, Jeff McNeil, Francisco Alvarez, Brett Baty, and then LeCastro, like he said, which none of us expect him to be the 9-hitter next year. Joe, I think for me, it's very hard to figure out what the lineup will look like in terms of the where, but I don't think it's very hard to figure out the who with this team. We know Brandon Nimmo is going to be out there. We know Francisco Lindor is going to be out there. We know that, barring a shock, Pete Alonso is going to be the opening day first baseman.
Yeah.
Francisco Alvarez is going to be the opening day catcher. It feels like Ronnie Mauricio did enough since being called up that he is going to be starting somewhere next year. Now, largely what Brett Beatty maybe does in spring training will dictate where Mauricio plays next year. There's a lot. This is why this is the shorter version of this conversation we're going to have a million times this winter. I think the only guy, I'll say it like this, and I want your opinion too on who you think is a little bit more fluid. The only guy in this lineup that I think has an kind of peculiar stance right now of maybe not 100% being back with the team next year. I do wonder how they view somebody like Jeff McNeil, where you paid him, the contract's very manageable. He finished the season really, really strong, but he had a horrific start to this season. Where he plays, if he's going to be a corner outfielder, okay, with Marte's current health, you do need corner outfield, and that's the reason against trading McNeil. But if you view him as your second baseman, well, that could be Mauricio or Acuna's spot for a team that I think wants to be more of a power lineup. That's just my take. I'm not saying they're trading McNeil. I'm just saying as I look at this, I know Nimmo's here. I know Lindor's here. I think Pete is here. And I know the young guys are all going to be back because you got to figure out what they are. We feel really good about Alvarez, but we want to see a bigger sample size of Ronnie and Beatty. McNeil is the one where I think he's here, but it would shock me the least out of all those names if he's not.
That's exactly how I was going to frame it. I would probably guess McNeil will be back, but Connor, that tradable contract, the versatility that is valuable to the Mets, obviously, is something that I think would make him very valuable and something that another team would want to give up control. Maybe you get controllable pitching for Jeff McNeil. So do you swap out someone like McNeil, who obviously was a good Met, won a batting title, really hot down the stretch, can play genuinely everywhere. Like he hasn't played catcher, but I bet he could. He played center field a little bit even at the end of the year. So I wouldn't be stunned if Jeff McNeil was someone that David Stearns maybe looked at as he provides value here, but can his value in trade outweigh the value he brings here, in addition to having the internal options of Ronnie Mauricio, who looked fine at second base, and Luis Angel Acuna is on the 40-man roster. Jet Williams is on, coming up, and those both are potential second base options. I think when you think about just the position players, I don't expect it to be drastically different. Francisco Alvarez is going to be behind the plate. Pete Alonso is probably going to be at first base. Second base is McNeil / Mauricio, maybe. Shortstop's Lindor. Third base, maybe that's Beatty / Mauricio. Outfield is a spot where I think you can pull something off. Nimmo's going to be in center. Left and right are in flux. Starling Marte's under contract for a lot of money, but he needs to prove he could stay on the field, and the Mets need to operate this offseason as if they cannot count on Starling Marte. And if he comes back and he's great and he performs, then awesome. You're going to be deeper and you'll have, maybe a better fourth outfielder, some like an upgraded version of what Tommy Pham gave them as a fourth outfielder. Maybe you sign someone like that. The position to watch, designated hitter. Yes. I don't think they're going to hand it to Mark Vientos. I think he may have a chance to compete for some role there. I don't expect Daniel Vogelbach to have that role, certainly as we head into 2024. And the Mets are going to be in on Shohei Ohtani. Right. Whether that's a good idea, whether that's a bad idea, we have 2 months to talk about the contract and everything that comes along with it. But if Shohei Ohtani gives any indication he wants to come east or is willing to come east, the Mets are going to be in on him. And frankly, will very well may offer the biggest contract of anyone for him. But even if it's not him, JD Martinez is out there as a free agent. Justin Turner is out there as a free. I think this is going to be the offseason that the Mets get an actual DH of some form. But obviously, as you heard me going through just position by position, there's not much room for the Mets to do much. This offseason to change their offense. And I don't think it needs to. I think it's a good offense. The pitching is what let the Mets down this year. And if they could fix the starting pitching in the bullpen, that offense is going to do plenty enough to put them in position to be a playoff contender.
I'm with you. I think that's the variable in the lineup, right? Like we think so many of those guys will be back, and maybe that doesn't excite fans, but there is this just total variable sitting there in Shohei Ohtani where
a $400 million variable that we have no idea.
I mean, it's ridiculous, but
or not. Yeah,
it's because I think Andy Martino, put this well. Didn't he say? He said on SNY that Steve Cohen shops for Picassos, right? And it's interesting when you think of Ohtani as more than a baseball player, which he's an incredible one, and how much he fits everything the Mets need. The Mets need power, and they need a DH, and there'll be a time again where he's a pitcher, and they need pitching. But there's also something to Cohen as a businessman and the marketing. I don't want to say enigma because he's not an enigma, but superpower that is Shohei Ohtani. Like there is a market that comes with Shohei Ohtani that is a total game changer. I mean, I don't know. I said this about Yamamoto, and it's a smaller degree because he's still an unknown. But the idea of Senga and Ohtani playing for the Mets gives the Mets this international star power that it's just fascinating for a sport that marketing is, I'm not going to say it's difficult, but it's not the same as the NBA and the NFL. And baseball is in a really good place. Like I saw recently how much the attendance numbers surged this year and all those things. But it feels like nobody's truly mastered how to be this marketing powerhouse in baseball in this era where everything is so dominated by social media and digital and everything like that. And the Mets have done a lot of really good things actually as innovators. Edwin Diaz's entrance on SNY, the Mets have the best booth in all of baseball. Like they do so many great things, but that is a whole nother variable to signing Ohtani where it's not just, hey, he costs $400 million. Hopefully he hits 40 home runs every year, and hopefully he's a Cy Young contending pitcher in 2 years again, because there is a dynamic from Cohen's business mind and Stearns' business mind too, that so much comes back with that investment that isn't just strictly on the field baseball related.
This year, I went to a Mets game at Citi Field and someone had an Ohtani Mets jersey on. He's not even on the Mets. Someone got an Ohtani Mets jersey made a year in advance. Unfortunately, I think he had number 16 on it, and that's being retired, so Ohtani can't have that number anyway. But Ohtani is the most unique baseball player in all, and this is, this is not hyperbolic, the most unique baseball player in the last 100 years, or just about 100 years.
Yeah, and there's nothing like it.
Yeah, there's nothing like him. The pitching is going to be the big question, and we'll talk about that as we move forward. What the success rate off a second Tommy John surgery is not the same as a first Tommy John surgery. So is he a reliever going forward? And if that's the case, what is a reliever and 40 plus home runs as a DH worth? Guy entering his 30s. That's talking just purely baseball, but off the field, if he's interested in being the face of baseball, Shohei Ohtani becomes the face of baseball at the snap of a finger the minute he signs a contract with the New York Mets, with the machine that Steve Cohen and this organization could put behind him, and a team that contends. Shohei Ohtani could be the biggest star in all of baseball.
I'll say right now, Joe, the biggest star in all of New York. Okay?
Yeah.
When you think about it, the state, and I get Aaron Judge, I get it. I mean, listen, I'm a New York sports fan. Like, there's Jalen Brunson. There's, the Rangers are a really talented team, but like hockey, it's just harder to be that star of the city, even though they have maybe the best goalie in the league. And you look at what Aaron Rodgers was to the Jets, but he got hurt. The city is starving for a superstar, not a star. Like Pete Alonso is a star, right? He's not a superstar. And that's not like an insult.
You're right. Yeah.
Ohtani is the most fascinating figure in his sport, in maybe the history of the sport. And when you place him in New York City, everything changes with that. So here we are. Time's a flat circle, Joe. We went from
we're back. We're back to Ohtani.
We're back to Ohtani.
We're back
on the David Stearns pod for today, and that's today's pod. This is the Mets pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. In all seriousness, thank you to everybody for a great regular season. A thank you to the Scoreboard champion, my co-host, and Joe. I don't know how he follows the minors and the big leagues and the MLB draft all year round, every single year, but he does it, and he does it better than anyone else. Thank you to our producer, Jeff, who behind the scenes does so much for this show. And thank you to everybody that tuned in every week throughout this regular season. And the best news for you is that the Mets pod will be here through every single week of an active offseason. We'll have guests, special shows, more giveaways to come. If you like those Mets pod shirts from our friend Dan at Athlete Logos. A note from last week's t-shirt giveaway with Athlete Logos. The winners have been chosen, and you will be hearing from us soon. So stick with us. We kind of come to life in the offseason. We really do. We love baseball. We love the regular season, but Joe and I were obsessed with team building. We were obsessed with what this organization is doing, and we can't wait to cover it for all of you every single week this winter and the late fall too. So remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. Thanks so much, everybody. As always, we'll talk to you next week.